Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Turkey's prime minister accuses the media of conspiring against his democratically elected government. But the critics say Tayyip Erdogan's just blowing smoke. If you can't beat him, join him. A record number of reporters have signed up with the Obama administration. 3 more journalists are murdered in Pakistan, and the Taliban say they did the killing. And when a masterpiece comes to life. That's our web video of the week. There's a huge political story unfolding in Turkey, and the media there aren't just reporting on it, they represent a key subplot. Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan's government is caught up in a corruption scandal, and some of the journalists and media outlets chasing the story have been paying the price with fines, prosecutions, and in some cases, their jobs. Turkey already had a sorry record on media freedom. The country was the world's biggest jailer of journalists long before the graft scandal came to light. And we've reported before here at The Listening Post on the corporate conglomerates that own most media outlets in Turkey, all of the business that those conglomerates do with the government through their other companies, and how the media outlets that they own do not want to jeopardize those business deals through critical reporting about the government. However, the winds are shifting, and news outlets that just a few months ago were happy to carry water for Erdogan's AKP are now all over the corruption story. The criticism has been sharp, and the instruments that the government is coming back at them with are blunt. Allegations that critical media are part of a conspiracy involving foreign powers who want a new government in Ankara. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of upcoming elections, in which the media and their ability to cover the vote will be a crucial part of the democratic process. All in all, it's going to be an interesting year in Turkey. Our starting point this week is Istanbul.
The media have been divided on this issue, as is the case with every issue.
Operasyonun başlamasıyla birlikte
There are truths both sides flag up. There are events both sides distort.
Hükümetten hala bu anlamda bir geri dönüş yok.
And there are wrongs on both sides.
Ne zaman Türkiye kalkınmaya başlamış, hep aynı oyunlar devreye sokulmuş.
What is currently happening in Turkey requires a very special reading into the media.
Any government facing a bribery scandal that has seen 3 cabinet ministers resign and 2 of their sons arrested would be in trouble. But for Tayyip Erdogan's AKP, what Turks call the AK party, it is particularly damaging. That abbreviation, AK, is Turkish for pure and white. Prime Minister Erdogan and the AKP marketed themselves as being above this kind of thing. Now Erdogan is fighting back, and he isn't mincing his words.
şunu da söylemek zorundayım. Tabii ki çok ciddi bir iftira kampanyası da var.
When the Prime Minister speaks, what he says is filtered, depending which Turkish media outlet is doing the reporting. Most of the biggest, most popular channels are considered pro-Erdogan. Their owners are conglomerates that don't want to risk billions of dollars in potential government business because of what their media outlets, which are worth mere millions, report. Some channels have remained beyond the government's reach and influence, as have various newspapers. One of the major opposition papers is called Today's Zaman.
There are some media groups which try to stay neutral, but the problem here is from the pro-government media side, they do not report massive allegation which is coming out of the prosecutor file, which includes hard evidence, video footages, wiretap, court-sanctioned wiretap records, and all this evidence they do not get reported in the pro-government media.
Merkez medyada çalışanlar,
those who work in the mainstream media are either being censored or applying self-censorship, often asking themselves, if I do this story, I may get into trouble. As for censorship from the outside, most media ownership is under the monopoly of big holding groups, groups that do business with the state and don't want to risk the relationships. So again, they apply self-censorship. There is criticism of the Prime Minister, but this occurs more in marginal media because it's not easy to do in mainstream media.
açıkçası çok kolay değil.
That self-censorship became crystal clear during last year's Gezi Park protests in Istanbul. Pro-Erdogan media initially ignored the story. One news channel showed a documentary on penguins in Antarctica rather than the news just down the street. This time, the story is about corruption. and a group called Gulen, a conservative social movement. Like the ruling AKP, Gulen is based on Islamic values and was allied with Erdogan. But they have since fallen out, and most of the police and prosecutors investigating the scandal who have been purged are Gulen members. In an email to the Listening Post, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Ibrahim Kalin, called Gulen a state within a state that uses the power of the state against whomever it considers to be its rival or enemy.
The Gülen movement is one of the Islamic communities in Turkey. It's the biggest one, with a big media empire, several NGOs, schools, charities, not just in Turkey but across the world. However, the controversy is less based on the Gülen movement's schools, institutions, civil society, but it is more based on the members of the Gülen movement within the police and the judiciary.
Devletin içindeki birçok alanda
But it was the government who originally appointed them to those positions, so the argument by the Prime Minister that there is a state within a state is not very convincing. They cooperated with them. They appointed them to those positions, and today they declare them the enemy. What happened?
neden, nerede ne oldu?
The Erdogan government has also gone after journalists over this story. When Mehmet Baransu of the Taraf newspaper published government documents relating to Gulen, the Prime Minister called it open treason. When Mahir Zeynalov of the pro-Gulen paper Today's Zaman tweeted on the scandal, the Prime Minister's lawyers took the journalist to court. When Murat Aksoy of the pro-government Yeni Shafak newspaper went on TV talking about the scandal, he was fired. There is no proof the government was behind that, but the TV host who interviewed Aksoy tweeted, "What an advanced democracy." Another 12 people, including journalists, were purged from the state-owned channel TRT, Gulen members reassigned for what the government called the benefit of the public. Gulen does have media holdings, but the 8 TV channels it owns or controls are small and attract less than 10% of the national audience. Many more channels with much higher ratings remain in Erdogan's corner. According to the government, the conspiracy is not limited to Gulen or even Turkey. One of the Prime Minister's senior advisors wrote a piece for Al Jazeera's website accusing Western media of Orientalism, saying their criticism of the AKP comes down to its Muslim values, not its democratic credentials.
I do admit there is an Orientalist bias in the Western media sometimes, but there has been Western media institutions which have supported the AKP government until a few years ago, when the AKP was known for its reforms and its democratic progress in Turkey. But they do now criticize the government for conspiratorial thinking, for pressure on the media, for a defined political rhetoric which polarizes society. So it is true that the Western media can be biased, but saying this should not lead to closing your eyes and ears from everything, every criticism that's coming from the West to Turkey.
Bu aşırı bir genellemedir. Yabancı medya bir.
It is too simplistic to say that the foreign media are part of a conspiracy. To say all journalistic activity, whether it's foreign or domestic, to make the same accusation against both, this is the Prime Minister's reaction to coverage. There are, of course, areas, points, where the coverage may have fallen short, but it's not possible to say that all journalistic activity is part of a conspiracy.
Baştan sona komplo diye adlandırılamaz.
The corruption scandal, the demonstrations that preceded it, and the contentious way both stories have been covered may prove to have a cumulative effect on elections to be held this year, both local and presidential. For a decade, the AKP and most of the Turkish media have been on the same page, with Tayyip Erdogan writing much of the script. The elections could well reveal if that story and the Turkish media have changed. Our Global Village voices now on the media story that's coming out of Turkey.
Both sides are really striving to shape the terms of this debate, but I think that the pro-Erdogan, pro-government side has been more successful. And I think that's perhaps simply due to the fact that the government has more leverage over more media outlets. The government has real influence over pretty much the entire mainstream media. And that's really been telling throughout this process.
Since January 5th, there's a report circulating in the Turkish media which suggests that the AKP supporting newspapers have lost their popularity from what used to be 60% now down to 32%. Same report also suggests that the popularity of the newspapers which are in opposition to the AKP government have risen. approximately they seem to have gained 1.5 million new readers.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. 3 Pakistani journalists have been murdered, a 4th wounded. The Pakistani Taliban has claimed responsibility and says the news organization brought the attack on itself with its brand of journalism. On January 17th, 3 employees of Express News TV, technician Waqas Aziz, driver Khalid Khan, and security guard Ashraf Yusuf died in Karachi after their van was sprayed with bullets fired from 2 motorbikes. The 4th man, a cameraman only identified as Mehtab, is reported to be in stable condition. The Pakistani arm of the Taliban, known as Tehreek-e-Taliban, told Express News through spokesman Ensign Nulla Ahsan that in the war of ideologies, all media channels, including Express News, are acting as propagandists and as rival parties. It's the 3rd attack in just 6 months on the Express Media Group, the most recent occurring in December, when its offices were fired upon. Commentators say the privately owned outlet is a target because it takes a critical stance on militant groups and the government. Bob Dietz of the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists condemned the attack. He said the inability or unwillingness of the authorities to bring perpetrators to justice for the prior attacks on Express illustrates how actors in Pakistan are emboldened to repeat violence against media outlets and bolster this pattern of impunity. Twitter has suspended the accounts of the military wing of Hamas. Up until January 17th, the group was able to communicate with its followers via its Al-Qassam Brigade account. Then Twitter pulled the plug on that account and at least 2 others. In one of its final tweets before the suspension, Hamas blamed Israel for its Twitter problem. That tweet read, "Israel will not prevent us from delivering truth to the world." There was also a response from the official account of the Israeli army, which wrote that Hamas is a terrorist group that uses social media to threaten Israel. The microblogging site has been used by the 2 groups to attack one another, especially at the height of the 2012 Israeli war on Gaza. Typically, Twitter does not comment on why it suspends accounts, but said that such suspensions can occur if there is a violation of its content rules. Press freedom advocates, however, are worried about this development. The London-based Index on Censorship said Gaza is not a haven for free media. Journalists of any nationality that operate on the ground there do so under heavy restrictions from a variety of parties. Social media, while potentially a tool for propaganda, is one of the few ways that the wider public is able to know what is happening inside Hamas. A veteran Egyptian columnist has been forced to backtrack from comments that he made on live television calling for the slaughter of Americans. On January 13th, Mustafa Bakri appeared on the privately owned channel CBC. He spoke of an alleged plan to assassinate the country's army chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Bakri said that the plan involves external and internal players, and when it happens, he said, quote, "All of Egypt will take up arms against the traitors and criminals all together, and they will be slaughtered in their homes." He also warned that, quote, "If anything happens to al-Sisi, there won't be an American on this earth. We will leave in peace here or abroad." The comments were then picked up by the Western media. They drew condemnation in the Twitter sphere. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry felt the need to get involved. It reportedly released a statement on the journalist's behalf, which said, "I am opposed to any violence, including any violence against U.S. citizens. The intention of my comments was to highlight Egyptian independence and our adamant refusal to allow any outside party, be that the U.S. or any other party, to interfere in internal Egyptian affairs." Journalists in Washington are supposed to know what's happening in the corridors of power. Then there are those who quit their jobs covering the news to work in politics and walk those corridors themselves. And it's a well-worn path. Since President Obama took office, a record number of journalists, 16, have taken up jobs in his administration. Politicians and the reporters who cover them are supposed to have an adversarial relationship. So what's at stake when the line between politics and journalism becomes blurred, with so much two-way traffic moving back and forth between the two? The Listening Post's Gauri Sharma now on some of the implications of the revolving door relationship that exists between the news business and the world of politics in Washington.
We have a notion of journalism as this very adversarial, take no prisoners, cover critically the institutions that have so much power.
Let's bring in our panel.
That's our idea of what journalism should be doing.
CNN contributor and former advisor to Mitt Romney, Kevin Madden.
There is a healthy tension, in fact a necessary tension, between those who cover events and those who make the policy.
Fox News contributor Governor Sarah Palin joins us. Governor, welcome back. Good to see you.
That healthy tension is what produces independent, unbiased, balanced coverage.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Switch on the news in the United States. That tension between the work of journalists and messaging by political operatives is vanishing.
But I'm very pleased to announce she has a new job. As of today, she is joining CBS News as
Nowadays, it's often the case that the same person who once shaped the policy is shaping what news audiences are told.
Well, this is a huge trend, and it's a huge moneymaker. From Fox News hiring Sarah Palin to the Today Show hiring Jenna Bush. The main thing is that these politicians have star power. In this day and age, politicians are celebrities in our world.
Karl Rove has been standing by. He's a former White House Deputy Chief of Staff and a Fox News contributor.
And for a news network, having somebody on their roster that's a recognizable big name is a huge win for them.
The reason there's so much sort of cross-pollination between politics and media is, frankly, these are things that people on both sides are trained to do. They are trained to go before cameras. They are trained to talk to strangers and talk in a very public way and act in a very public way.
Bill Clinton's passed his character test throughout his life and throughout this campaign.
George Stephanopoulos is a great example of someone who moved in the other direction. He was sort of a cult-like figure within the Bill Clinton campaign for president in 1992. He is now probably one of the top dog, on-air personalities at ABC.
Are you confident you can convince Congress not to pass new sanctions?
These are people who have traded on their notoriety that they got through government and have become media stars.
It's one of these situations where you realize that maybe TV journalism is a little bit more like acting. That the people who make the hiring and firing decisions saw him as someone who could perform on camera and decided that the way he performed as a spokesperson could translate into journalism.
If you can describe what that feels like to go from having your days literally numbered to being open-ended again.
But I think it diminishes the credibility of both of journalism and of, I think, the spin industry when you realize that it's talking into a camera is something he did on behalf of politicians, and now it's something he does as a quote-unquote journalist.
Part of the problem is that TV networks don't always disclose the political connections of their pundits.
With us on set, MSNBC.
Joe Scarborough hosts a daily show on MSNBC, but viewers may not know he was a Republican congressman for 6 years.
Time to bring in a new host of Crossfire, Stephanie Cutter.
Stephanie Cutter recently joined CNN as a political commentator, but in her previous role she was a political strategist for the Democratic Party. And Frank Luntz, who has a contract with Fox News and CBS,
I'm fine, Sean. Good to see you.
is also a strategist and pollster for the Republican Party. The Listening Post got in touch with CNN, ABC, MSNBC, Fox and CBS regarding the story. Only ABC responded, choosing not to comment. Tara Sonnenschein spent a year working in the Obama administration. She also served under President Clinton. In between those two jobs, she spent more than 10 years at ABC News.
If you cover foreign policy, you really want to know how foreign policy is made. A journalist knows how to explain stories, and I thought it would be very valuable to help in the communicating of U.S. foreign policy. And if you're going to work with journalists, you do need to understand the time clocks, their requirements, and what it is they're hoping to do. So profession to profession, I thought it was a very good transition.
It's seen as not that big a deal to go from one side to the other, and I think that's a big problem. Not because people who move from one side to another are not qualified or can't learn to do the other jobs. And it's not that they're not sincere in whatever they're trying to do, but I do think that in the collective it sends a very, very, frankly, troubling message about what the intent of the media is, and frankly I wish it wouldn't happen as often as it does.
The Obama administration has seen more journalists than ever, at least 16 taking jobs in the administration. The most recent move was made by Richard Stengel, former managing editor of Time magazine. Others include Linda Douglas, former ABC News reporter, and ex-Boston Globe political editor Glenn Johnson. Then there's Jay Carney, the former Washington bureau chief for Time magazine, who now faces off with the media as the White House's press secretary.
Well, Jay Carney was an elite Washington reporter who appeared on television a lot. So I think that made him an attractive selection for the White House. They wanted a press secretary who was, I think, familiar to viewers, and I think that's where this phenomenon can get a little, especially dicey.
When Obama was first running for office, his message was so carefully crafted to the public, and that was because he had so many journalists and members of the media on his team from day one. President Obama, having journalists on the inside is allowing him to convey the message in the way that he wants.
It's a fine line that a lot of these journalists walk, but as we learned in the Iraq War and the run-up to that, the journalists who I think did the most harm were the journalists who were closest to the powerful sources who were feeding them information. The journalists who did the best work, who were more confrontational, who were more skeptical, were the furthest removed from the corridors of power. It doesn't mean that journalists who are very close to sources within the government can't do good journalism, but I think it makes it more difficult.
One could argue that it was a journalist that got Barack Obama to the White House in the first place. A former reporter for the Chicago Tribune, David Axelrod joined Team Obama in 2003 when he was still in the Senate. As his chief strategist and media advisor, Axelrod is credited by many in DC for masterminding Obama's election win in 2008. 4 years later, he quit the White House, but has he really quit his job? Axelrod is now employed by the MSNBC News Network.
Joining us now is David Axelrod, former senior advisor for President Obama, now an NBC and MSNBC senior political strategist.
Did you get that? The anchorwoman called Axelrod MSNBC's political strategist.
Senior political strategist?
But actually, that was a slip of the tongue. David Axelrod is the network's political analyst, and if the anchorwoman is confused, imagine how viewers feel.
More Global Village voices now on the revolving door between media and politics in the United States.
When members of the press corps go to work in politics, usually as a spokesperson for a politician, and all of a sudden you have a press corps working with a spokesperson when they had been working as colleagues with a lot of trust and knowledge of each other then. And so I think that that leads to perhaps not necessarily lazy, but not quite as incisive reporting as it could be.
And nobody bats an eye when people like John Miller on CBS or Mika Brzezinski on NBC are presented as objective journalists, or even that what should be seen as their conflicts of interest somehow pass for analytical experience. Meanwhile, the independent journalists who criticize the government and act as a true watchdog to the government can expect at any time, under any administration in the last decade, to be fully scrutinized by the people who claim to be their peers in the field of journalism.
Finally, Rino Stefano Tagliafiero is an Italian animator who seems to have carved out a niche for himself in the world of digital art. Tagliafiero's thing is to take old paintings, masterpieces by artists like Michelangelo and Rubens, and by introducing just a little bit of movement digitally, he seems to breathe new life into the works. His edited collection reflects the cycle of life all the way through to death, and towards the end, the video gets rather dark. With more than 100,000 hits online, Beauty is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.